conquer. We look at that phrase in the Greek, it's very similar to going from one nation to the next, which is what we've all read and heard in the news about this coronavirus, which is looked upon as a toxin. So this is kind of an interesting concept. Now, for those that may not be familiar, now the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, is essentially the UN within the UN. This is the major think tank that contributes to a large degree to the other departments within the UN that makes decisions on a global scale. It just so happens that the CFR is composed of a majority of Americans. And the he, I kind of look at the he that sat on him as more of a conglomerate illuminist, because all the members that have voting rights in the CFR have to be members of the Illuminati. Okay, and these are all, you know, well accomplished members. You know, these are in categories of politicians, they're lawyers, financiers, department heads, media, tech moguls, professors, maybe even, you know, noted celebrities are also been involved. But these guys are literally playing into the adversary's hands, if you know anything about Illuminati. So we're anticipating some of the things that we read about in these last day chapters in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation. So let's take a moment. Let's look at this passage in Scripture, Matthew 24:15 through 26. Our Savior says, you know, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in a holy place, you know, that happened in 66 and a half, the latter part of 66 AD. He says that abomination of desolation standing in a holy place that Daniel speaks about. Well, the Romans did that desolation in the time near Tabernacles in 66 AD, at a time when there was probably a lot of people in Jerusalem. And when the Roman armies had surrounded Jerusalem, Vespasian had planted the Roman standard within the 60 cubits, I think it was, which was on the outside of that wall, the outer 60 cubits beyond the wall that surrounded the city of Jerusalem was sacred ground. And so with that standard, with all the idols on that pole that Vespasian or one of his leaders had planted, that was the key right there to let the people know. It says, let Judea. So here we are looking at the time in our age. What is that abomination of desolation standing in a holy place? Now, you'll notice I got the word Judea. If we take a look at this Hebrew word Judea, is Yahuda. Let's see, how would you pronounce that? Be Yadu. You could probably help me, Jackson.
Well, Yahuda.
Yahuda, okay. Which, if you break that up, it basically means Yah's community. So any community of Yahweh, when they see that abomination, they need to flee to the mountains. And he goes on to say, he says, pray that your flight be not in the winter nor in the sabbatical years, the proper interpretation of that. If you read that in its context, it says en sabbato, means in Sabbath, not on a Sabbath, and it doesn't say yom or the equivalent in Greek. It's so anytime the word sabbat, you know, Sabbath or sabbatical is referred to, it's always sabbado, and the determination as to whether it's a day or a year is determined by the context. And so in this context, it's all talking about days multiple times as you read it through. And so pray that your flight be not in the winter, because in this, or in the sabbatical year, because in the sabbatical year, do you not have, or you're supposed to have, 3 years of provision stored up? You don't want to be taken off when you got all those goods on hand. So we're going to be looking at sabbatical years too. So this time that we're anticipating is really called, he calls this the greatest tribulation. And he says, and except those days be shortened, no flesh is even going to be saved. But for the sake of the elect, he's going to cut that short. And we know that false prophets and messiahs, we've seen a lot of that already. But even the very elect can be deceived. Then he continues to talk about some of the signs in the sky. Let's take a look at some of those. Now, just a few years ago, some of you may have been privy to this. You remember that total solar eclipse that came about in August of 2017. And we're going to evaluate there in a minute, but let's take a look at this verse. Our Savior said, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give off her light, and the stars, it says, shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. We're going to evaluate this verse a little bit more closely. But so if we look at the sun being darkened, if it happens to be at the same time when the moon doesn't give off its light, what is that? That is a total solar eclipse. So when the moon goes in front of the sun, which is what happens with a solar eclipse, now the moon can no longer reflect the sun's light back to the earth. It's reflecting from the dark side, or what typically would be the dark side of the moon. So here we have the sun is no longer darkened, right? The moon does not reflect light, as it says. And so this total solar eclipse that more recently happened, that was August 21st, 2017, and it went across the continental U.S. in the largest sector of the continental U.S. in a diagonal fashion, went from the northwest Pacific coast to the southeast Atlantic coast, basically from northern Oregon into about the middle of South Carolina, covering the largest portion of the continental U.S. sometime before 1000 A.D. All the research that has been done regarding total solar eclipses on the United States, the study only went back to about 1000 A.D. So we're talking, over 1,000 years anyway. And its longest point of totality happened to be in the southern Illinois area, and that was just about in the center of the path, and that lasted for about 2 minutes 40 seconds, and its total span from the coast, from the Oregon coast to the South Carolina coast, was 2 hours 43 minutes. Now on April 8th of 2024, some of you are probably aware of this, there's supposed to be another total eclipse that's going to bisect the nation from the opposite direction. And here's a map that gives both of those courses. Here's the one that we had just a few years ago, right? Going in this fashion. And we have another one. You'll notice that this one's a little bit wider, coming up from Mexico. And it's going to go through Texas, the Mid-America area. It's going to go into northern Maine, Nova Scotia, basically the eastern Canadian provinces there. And its path will nearly be half the speed of the previous one, lasting not quite 4 hours, and will be much wider. And you can see that maybe not quite double the width, but it's the moon's going to be in greater perigee at that time than it was in 2017, and it crosses that previous path in southern Illinois, where that longest time was in the previous total solar eclipse, and this region of southern Illinois is called Little Egypt for several reasons. One being the little exodus that happened when there was a famine of sorts back in the northern portion of Illinois, back when the town of Chicago was developing, and many of the people living in that region went south looking for food, and so it was kind of considered a little exodus. That was back in the early 1830s. For another reason, there's a natural pyramid-shaped rock in the national park down there, about 2.5 stories high, and about on two sides, it's got a perfect pyramid shape. And then there's another rock formation called Camel Rock in that park. But probably more significantly is the fact that that tip of southern Illinois is bordered by two of the most voluminous rivers in the country. And again, here's that picture. This is where the Missouri meets the Mississippi on the west, and the Ohio River meets the southern tributary of the Wabash on the east. And so greatest amount of water anywhere in the continental U.S. comes right through that area. And so it has a similarity to a lot of people's in their mindset regarding the Nile Delta of Egypt, and consequently the southernmost city of southern Illinois is called Cairo. So here we have those two total solar eclipses bisecting in an area that's called Little Egypt.
I'm looking at it now on another page.
Okay.
Elizabethtown, Illinois, and Camel Rock.
Right.
What an unusual formation for up north.
Okay.
Up in that region, I've never seen anything like this.
And so the longtime residents of that area, you know, they even have celebrations, I think, different parts of the year that relate to Egyptian culture. Ancient Egyptian culture was kind of interesting, but so these two eclipses across the nation they actually do this within a 7-year period, which could be a foreboding for this entire nation, considering it's crossing here in this Little Egypt area. And the word Egypt in Hebrew, which is Mitzrayim, is the plural for the meaning painful trouble. And of course, we think about the time of trouble, considered to be the greatest tribulation time. I find that rather significant. And notice that this course of these two eclipses are making a depiction of a pictographic Hebrew letter, the letter Tav, and each letter of the Hebrew letter has a meaning. And interestingly enough, the meaning for Tav is sign. So here we have something, again, these are two solar eclipses within a 7-year period, crossing the heart of America and making a pictographic Hebrew letter right over the continental U.S. that means sign. So this is pretty plain that it's like, hello, let's take notice of what's happening here. So let's go back to Matthew 24:29. Let's look at that verse again. Here's a picture of a moon in a little closer to the Earth. This is more of a perigee. This is closer to what it would look like if you were actually looking at it from the sun. And how you see how that spot is right there. And when you have a moon in such perigee, that's going to cause it's so dark that the stars are going to come out. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to 100% zone back in August of 2017. We went to our in-laws' home. They happened to live just west of Salem in that 100% zone. And we set up our lawn chairs on the front lawn and watched that thing. And even with that total solar eclipse, which is pretty incredible, the stars came out for those 2 minutes and 10 seconds that was completely, the sun was completely obliterated. And so if the stars had come out then, can you imagine with this perigee going on, you're going to see a lot more stars. But let's look at this phrase, and the stars shall fall from heaven. Let's retranslate that actually, because we want to see how this actually fits in with this total solar eclipse. Well, if we go back and look at this word fall, it's the Greek word as it's listed in Strong's 4098, it's pedo, but its text form is peso, and it says in alternate tenses can mean to alighting or to light on. Now, Jackson, you might have a word on this, but so I kind of look at that as being to light on. And if that's true, then it would be the stars shall light on from heaven. So when the sun is darkened and the moon doesn't give its light in a total solar eclipse, what's going to happen? The stars are going to light on from heaven. So basically, all three of those elements involved, sun, moon, and stars, would all occur at the same time. So this would be a single event. The next phrase goes on, it says, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Heavens is plural, it's referring to our atmosphere. Yeah, just another twist in the you could also look at that. This also can be translated, strength of the atmosphere shall be reverberated, talks about like a frequency type concept. I couldn't help but think of, we know who the prince of the power of the air is. And maybe we're looking at maybe a critical disruption in telecommunications or surveillance that's going on. So we have some prophetic time periods that are mentioned in the books of Daniel and Revelation. The most common one amongst those two books is the 1260 days. And just to use Revelation 11 to point out that we're talking about the original calendar that Yahweh had intended for us, the 360, and that was, so it says in the holy city, Revelation 11, 2 and 3, it says, the holy city, again referring to Yah's people, shall be tread underfoot 42 months, and I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So here we have a concept of 42 consecutive months. Again, 30 days is the common denominator between these two numbers. So these are not lunar months. So the proper translation, whenever you see that in the Old Testament, new moon, and it's mentioned in the translations about 21 times, every single time that should be new month.
Big sticking point right there.
Yeah, and so I've done a study on that. I've got an appendices specific on that in the back of my book talking about this thing. And so if you eliminate new moon from the translation in the Old Testament, you have nothing to hang your hat on to use any kind of lunar calendar. Basically, that whole thing came from Babylon. So when the Jews had fallen into Babylonian captivity, they had no other recourse but to take on the Babylonian economic timekeeping of their captors, right? Maybe you can figure it out from there. That's kind of what.
I don't think the noun moon is even mentioned in any of those. I think it just says the new, and it's it's usually, you're right. It says in every single one of those 21 accounts, it's either Yom Kadesh, Hag Kadesh, or Moed Kadesh. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it has nothing. In fact, when the rabbis talk about Rosh Kadesh, that phrase is only found 7 times, and it's only found in the Torah. And every single time, even in our translation, it's referring to the beginning of the month. It's nothing about any moon. So the 1260 days is 42 months, is 3.5 years. And that is mentioned. So basically, we have a double witness here. So here, because it's mentioned in Daniel 7:25 and in Revelation 12:14, it talks about the time, singular, times, plural, and half a time. So 1 plus 2.5, that gives us 3.5 times or years. Because Revelation 12:6, when it talks about the 1260 days, it reiterates the same element by telling you time, times, and half a time, basically stating that this is specifically supposed to be 1260, and the exact same thing is relayed between Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 13:5. Okay, so you can check those out for yourself and see that this phrase, time, times, and half time, is referring to a 3.5 year time period. So this time span between the 7 feasts are 6 months. And so consequently, this 1260-day time frame can very easily go from a feast to have a starting point at a feast and end on a feast. Remember, the 1260 thing, this is based on a calendar that Yahweh intended for us to use, was an intercalated 360-day calendar with the 364. Okay, so now you can go from Rosh Hashanah to the Day of Trumpets. That gives you exactly 6 months. You got the choosing of the Lamb to the Day of Atonement. That's, again, 6 months. Or whether you go from Passover itself to the first day of Tabernacles, you're looking at 6 months. Or the last day of Convocation of UB to the last great day after Tabernacles. If you're familiar with those timepieces, basically the time elements in between here, these are all exactly 6 months. Now, here's an interesting point, kind of a mind blower. As we wind up the first part of this study, you might remember back in 2009, the date specifically was October 9th, that Barack Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. And I recall a lot of my friends were completely taken aback by that. You know, how was it that he deserved such a thing? He'd only been president a few months. What kind of things had he accomplished? Not in that category specifically. Well, that particular date, October the 9th, happened to be the Zionist, or if you will, using the lunar calendar, happened to be Tishri 21, or the last great day by that calendar. And looking at a 1260-day model, just prior to the 1260 days after this event, on March 22nd of 2013, happened to be just before that Passover, on Nisan 10. Again, this was according to the lunar calendar. On March 22nd, 2013, Barack Hussein Obama receives a dignitary's parade welcome into Jerusalem to receive the Israeli Peace Prize. So here he is back in 2009, receiving, basically being crowned the Prince of Peace of the world. And almost 1260 days later, the Israelis give him a publicly recognizable reward, a peace prize, of all the days to do it, was on the Zionist day for choosing the Lamb. What is that? Here we have the last great day. Here we have the choosing of the Lamb. Well, guess what? Now, to be precise for the 1260, we have to go to April 3rd of that year, which would basically finish up the lunar unleavened bread. They've had Passover. They've gone through the 7 days of unleavened bread. And so by April 3rd, let's see, after BHO had received the Israeli Peace Prize and declared to be the Zionist chosen lamb, if you will, right? To finish up those days, to make 1260, this is what happened after March 22nd, leading up to April 3rd. And this isn't all the news. These are just highlights that I'm giving you. So we have 2 mosque bombings in Iran, 1 in Afghanistan, 1 in Pakistan, mass murder in a Burmese mosque. Now, these are all these are all Muslim things. Remember, Barack Hussein Obama was crowned as an Israeli Prince of Peace. And then all this happens right at the end of unleavened bread. And then there's a mortar strike in Damascus, in Syria. A UN arms deal, the first of its kind, was blocked by North Korea. And it was blocked by North Korea, Iran, and Syria. That was on the 29th of March. North Korea then turns around and declares war on South Korea. We have strife in Venezuela. Maduro becomes president by a very thin margin. We know what we see his colors now. The Palestinian prime minister resigns and creates riots in the streets. And because of that mortar strike and some of the other elements relevant to that, the U.S. begins its involvement that that then instigates the Syrian civil war that had been going on for years after that. So this was the end of a 1260 time period, according to a lunar calendar. Pretty incredible.